The Unexpected Invitation. The night was cool and quiet in Los Angeles. A soft breeze moved through the trees outside a small art gallery, and warm golden lights spilled onto the street. Inside, famous actors and directors mingled with painters and musicians. But in the corner, away from the noise, Keanu Reeves stood alone with a thoughtful expression. He looked at a painting of a lone lighthouse surrounded by dark waves. Something about the image reminded him of quiet nights when he had felt lost yet hopeful. As he stared at the painting, he heard a gentle laugh behind him. It was Sandra Bullock. She had entered the gallery quietly, wearing a simple navy dress that made her look graceful without trying. She walked toward him with a smile that carried both warmth and curiosity. "I didn't expect to find you hiding here," she said softly. Her voice had a calmness that made even the loud room feel still. Keanu turned to her, his eyes soft. "Sometimes the corner is the only place where you can hear your own thoughts," he replied. For a moment, they both just stood there, watching the painting together. They had worked on movies years ago, shared laughs on set, but their paths had drifted apart. Tonight felt different, like a door quietly opening again. In the first minutes of this story, the hook forms. Two beloved actors, known for kindness and humility, crossing paths again when neither expected it. The room's noise faded as if the universe itself wanted them to listen to one another. A friend approached Sandra, asking her to join a group discussion. She smiled but stayed where she was. "I'll be there in a minute," she said, then turned back to Keanu. "This painting, it feels lonely but also safe." Keanu nodded. "Maybe loneliness can be gentle if you hold it the right way." His words surprised her. She realized she had missed talking with someone who understood things without needing long explanations. Outside, light rain began to fall. The event was beautiful but busy, and Sandra felt the weight of constant attention. She glanced toward the door, then at Keanu. Something inside her whispered that she needed a break from the crowd. "Would you like to get some coffee?" she asked. Her voice was soft, almost uncertain, as if she worried the world would judge her for wanting something so simple. Keanu blinked, then smiled slowly. "Coffee sounds perfect," he said. They left through a side door, slipping into the gentle rain like two people escaping a dream. The city lights glimmered on wet pavement. Their steps echoed softly as they walked toward a quiet cafe a few blocks away. Inside the cafe, the smell of fresh pastries and roasted beans wrapped around them like a blanket. There were only a few people inside, and the low hum of a song played in the background. Keanu ordered 2 black coffees, and Sandra chose a slice of lemon cake for them to share. When she laughed about how she always ordered dessert first, Keanu's eyes sparkled with a rare kind of joy. For the first few minutes, they spoke about small things, films, mutual friends, the rain outside. But as time passed, their words deepened. Sandra spoke about moments when fame had felt heavy, and she had questioned whether kindness still mattered in a world that moved so fast. Keanu listened with quiet respect, nodding gently. He shared stories of nights on empty roads, of helping strangers without them knowing who he was. The suspense grew quietly. This wasn't just a casual coffee. It was a meeting that might change the shape of their hearts. When the rain outside turned into a soft drizzle, Keanu suggested a walk. They stepped outside, holding the single umbrella the cafe lent them. The world around them felt softer now, the traffic quieter, the lights warmer. As they reached a small bridge over a shallow river, Sandra stopped. "You know," she said, "people always expect us to have perfect lives. But sometimes it's just about small things, like sharing lemon cake." Keanu looked at her, the city's reflection dancing in his dark eyes. "Small things can be the most important," he replied. A sudden gust of wind blew rain onto their faces, and they laughed. In that laughter, something unspoken grew. A reminder that even stars could feel human, vulnerable and grateful for simple company. Just as they turned to head back, they heard a faint sound, a cat crying under a bench. Sandra bent down and found a tiny soaked kitten shivering. Without hesitation, she wrapped her scarf around it. Keanu gently stroked the kitten's head, his hands steady and warm. "We can't leave it like this," Sandra said. "Then we won't," Keanu answered. They walked back to the cafe, the kitten tucked safely between them. The barista smiled when he saw the tiny creature and offered a small box with a towel. The kitten purred softly. Safe now because two people had chosen kindness over convenience. As they watched the kitten settle, Sandra whispered, "Maybe tonight was supposed to happen." Keanu didn't respond with words. He just nodded slowly, his eyes full of meaning. The night that began with art and rain had quietly turned into something sweeter. A shared moment of compassion, a spark of connection, and a promise that the story between them was far from over. The morning after the quiet coffee date, Sandra woke to soft sunlight filling her bedroom. The sound of rain from the night before had faded, leaving behind a fresh scent that drifted in through the open window. She sat at the edge of her bed, replaying every moment, the laughter under the umbrella, the tiny kitten's warm purr, and Keanu's thoughtful eyes that seemed to listen even when she wasn't speaking. Something about last night felt fragile, like a delicate thread she didn't want to break. Keanu, in his small apartment filled with books and old guitars, made tea instead of coffee. He stared at the steam curling above the cup, wondering why a simple evening had felt so significant. He wasn't used to expecting anything from people. Kindness, for him, was usually something given quietly and left behind. But Sandra's laughter had stayed with him like a song he couldn't stop humming. Hours later, Sandra checked her phone and saw a message. It was from Keanu. "Hope the kitten is okay. I named him Comet in my head." She smiled, her heart softening. She replied, "Comet likes lemon cake crumbs. I think he already misses you." Beneath her playful tone, there was a tremor of emotion, an unspoken admission that she missed him too. That afternoon, Sandra received an unexpected call. It was from a charity organizer she supported. There was a last-minute fundraising event scheduled at a children's community center. They were short on volunteers and needed someone who could lift the kids' spirits. She agreed instantly, and without thinking too hard, she sent Keanu a message. "They need help at the center tonight. No pressure, but if you're free." She hesitated before pressing send, unsure if he would want to join. Keanu read the message while strumming a quiet tune on his guitar. For a brief moment, he felt a familiar hesitation, the voice that told him to keep his world small and safe. But then he thought about Sandra's scarf wrapped around the kitten, the way her laughter had felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. He typed back, "Tell me the address. I'll be there." When evening came, the community center buzzed with nervous energy. Colorful drawings lined the walls, and paper lanterns hung from the ceiling. But outside, a problem was unfolding. A delivery truck with donated supplies had broken down several miles away. The organizers worried the children would be disappointed without the planned activities. Sandra and Keanu arrived just as whispers of doubt spread among the volunteers. Sandra noticed the worry in the children's eyes. Some of them had waited weeks for this night. She glanced at Keanu. Without a word, they understood what needed to be done. "I have an idea," Sandra whispered. "Can you stall them with a story?" Keanu nodded. He gathered the children on the floor in a circle. He began softly, his voice steady and gentle. "Once, on a night just like this, a small lighthouse stood against a storm. The waves tried to drown its light, but it kept shining." His words painted pictures that pulled the children in, their faces glowing with wonder. He wove suspense into his story, a ship lost in the dark, a brave sailor following a faint light, and a promise that even in the worst storms, kindness could guide the way. As the children listened, Sandra quietly organized volunteers to create games using whatever supplies they had. A few scarves became flags for a relay race. Plastic cups turned into makeshift bowling pins. By the time the truck finally arrived, laughter had already filled the room. The children didn't notice the delay. They were too caught up in the joy of the moment. One little girl tugged on Keanu's sleeve after his story. "Is the sailor okay now?" she asked, her eyes wide. Keanu knelt down, smiling softly. "He's safe," he said, because someone believed in the light. His words weren't just for the girl. They were for Sandra, too. When the supplies finally arrived, the room exploded with excitement. Music played from an old speaker, and the kids began dancing. Sandra and Keanu joined them, laughing like they hadn't in years. In that moment, surrounded by children's joy and paper lanterns swaying gently overhead, something shifted. Their shared kindness was no longer a coincidence. It was becoming a bond. Later that night, when the event ended and the volunteers began cleaning up, Sandra found Keanu outside under the stars. The city lights glimmered far away, but above them the sky was clear and full of possibilities. "You were amazing tonight," she said quietly. Keanu shook his head. "You were the amazing one. You turned paper cups into laughter," Sandra smiled. "I think maybe we both did." There was a pause, the kind that carries meaning without needing words. Then, just as they prepared to leave, a teenage boy approached them. He was one of the older kids from the center. "Thank you," he said shyly. "I've been having a rough time tonight. It made me feel like things can get better." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Keanu put a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Things can always get better," he said gently. "Sometimes it just takes one light to remind you." As they walked back to their cars, Sandra glanced at Keanu. "You know," she said, "small acts like this, they ripple out. They matter more than people think." Keanu looked at her, his expression soft but intense. "Yeah," he replied. "And sometimes the smallest moments are the ones that stay with you forever." Neither of them said it out loud, but they both knew something was changing. The night had started with a simple invitation. Now, under the quiet stars, it felt like a story neither of them wanted to end. A week passed, but the memory of that night at the community center lingered like a soft echo in both their hearts. Sandra found herself smiling at odd moments, while pouring coffee, while scrolling through messages, whenever she thought about the way Keanu's eyes had softened as he comforted that teenage boy. She realized it wasn't just his words that mattered. It was the quiet steadiness behind them, the kind that could calm a storm without anyone noticing. One afternoon, while filming on set, Sandra received a text, "Comet is officially a menace. He tried to climb my guitar." A photo followed. The tiny kitten balanced awkwardly on the edge of a guitar case, eyes wide with mischief. Sandra laughed so loudly that a makeup artist glanced over. She quickly typed back, "He just wants to be a rock star like his new dad." Beneath the teasing, her chest ached warmly. These small exchanges had become the brightest parts of her day. That evening, Sandra returned home to find a small box on her porch. Inside was a folded note and a sprig of wildflowers. The note, written in simple, almost shy handwriting, read, "For no reason other than today needed a small kindness. K." She held the flowers close, feeling an unexpected lump in her throat. Later that week, she invited Keanu to join her at a quiet riverside trail. "No crowds," she promised. "Just trees and water." When he arrived, dressed simply in a gray sweater and worn jeans, he brought Comet in a little carrier. The kitten meowed impatiently until Sandra laughed and let him out to explore. The path was lined with fallen leaves, and the gentle sound of the river filled the air. As they walked, Sandra told him about a recent script she had rejected because it lacked heart. "I don't care about flashy scenes anymore," she admitted. "I care about stories that make people feel less alone." Keanu nodded, his gaze steady on the flowing river. "Maybe that's what we're all looking for, something that reminds us we're connected." His words hung in the air like a quiet revelation. The trail led them to an old wooden bridge, its planks worn smooth by time. The bridge overlooked a bend in the river where the water sparkled in the late afternoon sun. They leaned on the railing, standing so close their shoulders nearly touched. Then, without warning, the sky shifted. Dark clouds rolled in, and a sudden wind rustled the trees. Sandra glanced upward. "Do you think we should head back?" Before Keanu could answer, a sharp cry echoed across the riverbank. They turned to see a small boy, no older than 8, standing near the edge of the water. His dog's leash was tangled in a branch stuck midstream, and the dog was whimpering, half in the water. The boy looked panicked, frozen in fear. Sandra's heart raced. "We have to help," she said. Keanu didn't hesitate. He jogged toward the boy, calling out gently, "Hey, it's okay. We'll get your dog." The boy's wide eyes flicked between the rushing water and the tall stranger approaching. Keanu carefully stepped onto the shallow part of the bank, testing the slick stones beneath his feet. The dog whimpered louder. Sandra grabbed a sturdy branch and offered it to Keanu for balance. Together, with calm voices and steady movements, they managed to untangle the leash and pull the trembling dog to safety. The boy clutched his pet, tears streaming down his cheeks. "Thank you," he whispered. Sandra crouched down to his level. "You were so brave to stay with your dog," she said, her voice soft but full of admiration. The boy sniffled. "I thought no one would hear us." Keanu placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Someone always hears, even when it feels like no one does." As they watched the boy and his dog disappear down the trail, the rain began to fall. It wasn't heavy, just a soft drizzle that turned the world silver. Comet meowed from the carrier, unimpressed by the weather. Under the shelter of a large oak, Sandra and Keanu stood close, their breath mingling in the cool air. The moment felt suspended, like the universe had handed them a quiet secret. Sandra looked up at him, raindrops glistening on her eyelashes. "You didn't even think twice," she said. "Neither did you," Keanu replied. They both laughed softly. But there was an unspoken weight beneath their laughter, a growing awareness that these shared acts of kindness were stitching their hearts together. When the rain eased, they walked back toward their cars. Keanu carried the kitten's carrier, and Comet pawed at the sides like an impatient child. Sandra slipped her arm through Keanu's, a gesture so natural it startled them both. But neither pulled away. Before leaving, they stopped near the river once more. The clouds had parted just enough to let a single beam of sunlight break through, painting the water in gold. Sandra whispered, almost to herself, "Small lights, even in storms." Keanu turned his head slightly toward her. "Exactly," he said. And in that quiet confirmation, a deeper connection settled between them, as sure and steady as the river below. Driving home later, Sandra replayed the image of him stepping into the water without hesitation, of his steady hands and calm voice. She realized that his kindness wasn't a performance, it was his nature. And that thought warmed her more than any romantic gesture ever could. That night, Keanu sat on his couch with Comet curled beside him. The city outside his window sparkled with distant lights, but his mind was on the afternoon. The boy's grateful eyes, Sandra's laugh, the way her hand had fit perfectly around his arm. He picked up his guitar and strummed a gentle melody. It wasn't a song he knew. It was something new, born from the quiet joy of the day. The story of their connection was no longer just unfolding. It was beginning to weave itself into the fabric of their lives. And though neither of them said it out loud, they both sensed that something extraordinary had quietly taken root. Days turned into another week, but the golden reflection of the river still glowed quietly in their memories. Sandra found herself doodling tiny waves and little lighthouses in the margins of her script notes, smiling without realizing it. Every time her phone buzzed, her heart lifted just a little, hoping it might be Keanu. One morning, Sandra received a message that made her pause. "Would you like to go somewhere no one expects us to be?" The words were simple, but the mystery in them sparked something in her chest. She typed back, "As long as it isn't a red carpet event." Seconds later, his reply came, "Promise. Dress casual. Bring your curiosity." That afternoon, Keanu picked her up in an old motorcycle sidecar he had restored himself. Its chrome gleamed under the sun and the engine purred softly. Comet's carrier was strapped securely behind them, a tiny paw pressing curiously against the mesh. Sandra laughed when she saw the setup. "This is ridiculous," she said, but her grin betrayed her excitement. They rode out of the city, the wind tangling her hair as the skyline shrank in the distance. The roads grew quieter, lined with tall trees that reached toward the blue sky. After nearly an hour, Keanu pulled up beside a forgotten railway bridge. Wildflowers had overtaken the edges, and an old sign read, "Maple Crossing," in faded letters. "This was my father's favorite spot when he needed peace," Keanu said quietly. "I used to come here as a teenager to play guitar and think." Sandra stepped onto the wooden planks of the bridge, feeling the boards creak gently beneath her feet. Below them, a slow-moving river caught the sunlight like strands of silk. The air smelled of earth and flowers. They set out a small picnic on the bridge's edge, sandwiches, bottled water, and a slice of lemon cake Sandra had secretly packed. Comet sniffed the air approvingly. As they ate, they spoke about small, personal things, childhood memories, secret fears, the books that had once saved them on lonely nights. Then a sound interrupted the calm. Faint music drifting from deeper in the forest. It was delicate, like wind chimes, but with rhythm. Sandra glanced at Keanu. "Do you hear that?" He nodded. "Let's find out." They followed the sound until they reached a small clearing. There, a group of teenagers had set up an impromptu outdoor jam session with battered instruments. One of the boys' guitars had a broken string, and the music stumbled to a halt. Keanu stepped forward. "Mind if I help?" he asked softly. The teenagers froze for a second, then one of them stammered, "You're Keanu Reeves." Keanu smiled modestly, just someone who knows a few chords. He knelt, fixed the string with practiced hands, and strummed a gentle melody that melted into the breeze. The teenagers joined in hesitantly, then with growing confidence. Sandra clapped along, her laughter carrying across the clearing. One of the girls shyly admitted she wanted to be a musician, but felt she wasn't good enough. Keanu handed her the guitar. "Play," he said. "Don't wait to feel perfect. Music isn't about perfection, it's about truth." Her tentative notes filled the air, and the clearing seemed to glow with something bigger than all of them. Later, as the sun began to set, Sandra and Keanu walked back to the bridge. The sky turned shades of pink and amber, and the wildflowers around them swayed gently. "You could have told them who you are," Sandra said softly. "But you didn't." Keanu shrugged lightly. "They don't need a celebrity. They just need someone to listen." She looked at him, her heart tightening with admiration. "That's what makes you different." As they reached the bridge again, Comet meowed, drawing their attention to a small folded piece of paper wedged between the wooden planks. Sandra picked it up carefully. It was an old note, weathered by time with faded handwriting. "To whoever finds this, kindness is the only bridge worth crossing." They both stood still, holding the fragile paper between them. The coincidence was almost eerie, yet it felt like the universe had whispered a message meant only for them. A breeze picked up, carrying the scent of wildflowers. Sandra whispered, "Do you ever feel like life leaves small signs for us?" Keanu nodded slowly. "All the time. You just have to be quiet enough to notice." The ride back to the city was silent, except for the hum of the motorcycle and the distant chirping of crickets. Sandra rested her head lightly against Keanu's shoulder as the city lights appeared on the horizon. The quiet between them wasn't empty, it was full of unspoken things. Later that night, Sandra couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the broken guitar string, the teenager's trembling hands, the note on the bridge. She opened her journal and wrote, "Some bridges aren't built with wood or stone. They're built with small acts of courage and kindness." She closed the book and smiled, knowing she didn't need to send those words to Keanu. He already understood. At his apartment, Keanu placed the old note on a shelf beside his guitar. Comet curled up beside it as if guarding a treasure. Keanu gazed at the paper, its words echoing in his mind. He strummed a quiet tune, one that sounded like hope, and let it drift into the night. Several days passed, and Los Angeles seemed to hum with a different kind of energy. Sandra felt it in the way the sunlight seemed warmer, in the way small things, like a stranger's smile or the sound of rain against her window, suddenly mattered more. On set, her co-stars noticed the quiet glow about her. Someone even teased, "Someone's heart looks a little lighter these days." She brushed it off with a laugh. But inside, she knew they weren't wrong. One evening, Sandra received an unexpected call from an old friend who ran a neighborhood bookshop on the edge of town. The store was in trouble. Foot traffic had dropped, and a corporate chain was opening nearby. "We're holding a last-minute reading tonight," her friend said. "We just want to remind people what stories can mean. Could you come? Even if it's just to sit and listen?" She almost said yes quietly, then paused and texted Keanu instead. "Want to hear some stories tonight? Small bookshop, good cause." His reply came almost instantly. "Lead the way. I'll bring Comet for moral support." They arrived at the shop just as the sun began to set, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink. The bookstore's windows glowed warmly, a refuge against the approaching night. Inside, the smell of old paper and fresh tea filled the air. Only a handful of people sat scattered among the mismatched chairs, their faces a mix of curiosity and nostalgia. An elderly woman with kind eyes and silver hair stepped up to the small podium. She began reading a passage from a forgotten classic, her voice trembling slightly. But halfway through, her glasses slipped, and the paper fluttered from her hands. A ripple of nervous laughter passed through the room. Before anyone else could react, Keanu stepped forward quietly, retrieving the paper with a small bow. "May I?" he asked gently. The woman nodded, her eyes wide. Keanu began to read where she had left off, his voice low and steady, carrying the words like precious cargo. The room fell completely silent. Even Comet, perched in his carrier, seemed to listen. His voice wasn't polished or theatrical. It was honest. Each sentence felt alive like a heartbeat. Sandra watched him and felt a pang in her chest. It wasn't the famous actor standing there. It was a man who believed in the power of words, in giving them the respect they deserved. When the reading ended, the small audience erupted into applause, some wiping away tears. The elderly woman clasped his hand. "You saved my moment," she whispered. "You saved ours first," Keanu replied softly. After the reading, the group lingered, sharing stories about their favorite books and the memories tied to them. Sandra wandered through the shelves, running her fingers along worn spines. She found a small poetry collection with a handwritten note inside. "For whoever finds this, may these words meet you when you need them most." She showed it to Keanu, and they exchanged a look that said everything without words. Suddenly, the shop's front door banged open as a gust of wind swept in, scattering a few papers. A teenage boy stood there, breathless and dripping from a sudden downpour. "I'm sorry," he said, holding a crumpled flyer. "I saw the sign about the bookshop closing. I came because this place saved me once." His voice cracked with emotion. The boy explained how years ago he had hidden between these very shelves to escape a rough day at school. A kind bookseller had handed him a book that made him feel seen for the first time. "I didn't want this place to disappear without saying thank you," he finished quietly. The room was silent, the weight of his words sinking in. Sandra's throat tightened. She stepped closer and said gently, "Thank you for sharing that." Sometimes places hold our stories even when we forget to tell them. Moved by the boy's confession, Keanu suggested they do something bold. "What if we buy a stack of books tonight and leave them here, so others can keep finding their stories?" Sandra's eyes lit up. "Better yet," she added, "let's leave notes inside each one. Little messages for whoever needs them." They spent the next hour choosing books, slipping handwritten notes into the pages. Some messages were simple. "You're not alone." Others were playful. "This book chooses you today." The boy helped too, his hands steady now, his face glowing with purpose. As they left the store, the rain had stopped. The street glistened under the lamplight, puddles reflecting tiny galaxies of light. Comet peered out from his carrier, wide-eyed. Walking beside Keanu, Sandra whispered, "You turned a closing night into something unforgettable." Keanu shook his head. "We all did. Sometimes all it takes is one person walking through the door to remind everyone why it matters." On the way back, they stopped at a quiet park bench beneath an old oak tree. The city buzzed faintly in the distance, but here, it felt like the world had slowed down. Sandra rested her head on Keanu's shoulder. "I used to think big gestures were the ones that counted," she murmured. "But now, it's these small, quiet things." Keanu's voice was barely above a whisper. "Small things build the strongest bridges." A gentle breeze carried the scent of wet earth and blooming flowers. In that simple, perfect silence, neither of them needed to say anything else. That night, Sandra placed the poetry book she had found on her nightstand. She traced the handwriting on the note again and thought of the boy, the elderly woman, the little bookshop. She thought of Keanu's steady voice reading to a room of strangers. She realized that each moment, small on its own, was weaving into something far bigger. At his apartment, Keanu unpacked the empty bag that had once held books. Comet curled up on the couch, purring softly. Keanu strummed his guitar, playing the melody that had followed him since the bridge. As the notes filled the room, he felt the quiet certainty that some stories don't just happen. They choose you. Several weeks had passed since the night at the bookshop, but its echoes still followed them. Everywhere Sandra went, on set, in traffic, even in the grocery store, she noticed small acts of kindness she might have once overlooked. She began leaving small notes for strangers, a smiley face on a cafe receipt, a kind word on a napkin. And every time she did, she remembered Keanu's quiet voice reading in that warm little store. Keanu, too, felt the shift. People often spoke of him as the stoic actor, the humble man on a motorcycle. But now, with Sandra's laughter still ringing in his ears, his world seemed brighter. Even Comet, the once-abandoned kitten, had begun to feel like a symbol of their bond, a small life brought into their orbit by a night of rain and shared compassion. One breezy Saturday, Sandra invited Keanu to an outdoor charity gala for the children's center they had visited weeks earlier. The event was low-key, held in a park strung with fairy lights and long wooden tables. The air smelled of grilled vegetables and fresh bread, and the laughter of children floated through the twilight. As they walked in hand for the first time, a few heads turned, but most people simply saw two friends sharing a quiet joy. The teenage boy from the community center spotted them and ran over, his eyes shining. "I'm still working on my sketches," he said excitedly, pulling a small drawing from his pocket, a sketch of a lighthouse on a stormy sea. Beneath it, he had written, "Even small lights guide lost ships." Keanu studied the drawing, his voice warm. "You're going to guide more ships than you realize," he told the boy. The evening unfolded gently. Music from a local band, children chasing each other between tables, volunteers swapping stories. Sandra watched as Keanu bent down to listen to a young girl explain her handmade bracelet. He looked at her as if her words were the most important in the world. Sandra felt her chest tighten, not from sadness, but from awe. Suddenly, a brief moment of suspense rippled through the crowd. A power outage swept across the park, plunging the lights into darkness. A few children gasped, and a hush settled over the tables. Keanu reached for Sandra's hand. "Stay here," he whispered gently and stepped forward. Pulling out his phone, he switched on the flashlight and held it high. Other guests followed suit, small lights blinking on one by one. Soon, a constellation of tiny beams dotted the park, casting soft, wavering glows. The children began to laugh again, their fear forgotten. Someone strummed a guitar, and voices rose in an impromptu song. In that circle of light, Keanu returned to Sandra's side, his face glowing faintly. "It's like the note on the bridge," she said quietly. He nodded. "Kindness is the only bridge worth crossing." As the lights flickered back on minutes later, applause rippled through the crowd, not for the electricity, but for the way everyone had come together in those dark moments. Later, after the tables were cleared and the children had gone home, Sandra and Keanu stayed behind, sitting on a blanket under a vast night sky. Comet purred softly between them, content. "When we first ran into each other at that art gallery," Sandra began, her voice low, "I didn't think a single evening could change so much." Keanu looked at her, his expression gentle. Maybe it wasn't just the evening. Maybe it was every small choice after it. The coffee, the kitten, the bridge, the bookshop, tonight. Small things that built something bigger. She felt tears prick her eyes, but they were the good kind, the kind that come from gratitude. "I used to think big dramatic moments defined a life," she said. "But now, I think it's lemon cake crumbs, rescued kittens, and broken guitar strings." He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Small things build the strongest bridges," he repeated, his voice soft as the wind. A shooting star streaked across the sky, quick and quiet. They watched it disappear, then turned to each other. Neither needed words. They leaned closer, their foreheads touching for a brief, tender moment, a gesture of trust more intimate than any grand declaration. In the distance, Faint city lights shimmered, but here under the stars, it felt like the world had paused just for them. Their laughter from the bookshop, the river, the bridge, and the park all seemed to fold into this single breath of silence. Eventually, Sandra whispered, "One sweet date." "And look where it led." Keanu smiled, his eyes glistening. "It led us here, and here feels like forever." Comet stretched lazily between them, a tiny reminder of the night that had started it all. As they held each other beneath the stars, neither of them worried about tomorrow or the world's expectations. They understood now that life's greatest changes often begin quietly, with a simple act of kindness, a shared slice of cake, and one sweet date that brought two souls closer than ever.